Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Snow Day. This is Valu. She is going to help me teach today. We are going to be covering chapters 11, 12, and 13, that is middle childhood. I'm going to have 3 videos, one for each chapter. So download the slides and we will go through the PDFs as we have them, and let's get started on middle childhood. So if you are on the slides for middle childhood, this is chapter 11, the biosocial development. We will move down to slide number 5. Just to kind of, parse out what it is that we're talking about. Middle childhood is the period between early childhood and early adolescence. It's typically 6 to 11-ish. There's no real clear line between when someone leaves early childhood and enters into early adolescence, but it's around that time frame for most kids, and that's typically what we're talking about within developmental psychology. Biologically speaking, this is actually one of the safest periods in a person's entire life, and especially after that tumultuous beginning that we see in neonatal development and in infancy and even early childhood. Suddenly our bodies are more or less stable. We have developed certain balance and abilities to move and control our bodies, so we become much less accident prone. We have also surpassed the time period during when most infancy and childhood diseases that might cause death occur. Certainly people do die during middle childhood, but the rate is the fewest, I believe, from any time period in our entire lives. On slide 6, you can actually see a nice little graph showing off how we have that dip of safety, at least in terms of health and mortality during this time period. Moving on to slide number 7, you can see that good childhood habits are very important to develop, and they predict later adult health. They also protect later adult health because they tend to become lifelong habits. Oral health is very important. We talked about this with early childhood. During this time, muscles are becoming stronger, and this includes our internal muscles, the heart and lungs, the stuff in our torsos. Children can run faster and exercise longer than they have been previously, and they can also build up these muscles for additional strength. They're starting to master motor skills that they'll be able to use moving forward. On slide number 8, we can see that there are a number of contributions toward active play. When kids are feeling better, they go out and play. When they develop an appreciation of cooperation and fair play, when they learn respect for teammates, and they can also learn these things through fair play, especially when it is supported and motivated within a school setting or an after-school setting. Neighborhood games can be really fun and can really help kids learn all of these interpersonal skills as well as build up their physical bodies and their coordination. However, there are certain hindrances that we're experiencing within our society. So stranger danger is one of them. Kids I would say probably in most of the United States are taught about how strangers are dangerous, but in certain communities there's a real and active fear. When I was working in Chicago, one of the difficulties that we had with kids playing is there was violence on the streets at times. We have periodic drive-by shootings, and there are certainly places and times in which it is not safe for kids to go outside and play. And in order to keep their kids safe, parents would have to keep their kids inside the house, which of course is not good for active cooperative play. We also have shifts in our education policies, eliminating recess, eliminating after-school programs, just basically shutting down access to outside play within the environment, which is really too bad because that movement, that physical movement within our bodies actually does allow for cognitive development as well, and releases a lot of the energy that gets bounded up in kids that allows them to learn better throughout the day when they're able to have these periodic moments of playtime. Some of the risks that we see, this is on slide 9, from sports activity, loss of self-esteem. Kids can be so cruel, and sometimes coaches too, or parents. If you've ever been in the stands of a game, you always see those parents, what the hell are you doing? There's of course injuries that can happen, and some of them including like serious injuries like concussions. And when someone experiences multiple concussions throughout their lives, it can cause like pretty long-term damage and change rates of like even Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia much later in life. Sometimes there can be reinforcements of prejudice. Girls can't play ball, and this can cause, increased stress, even insomnia. And so it's not like, this is just a catch-all 100% good for all people, but it can be done well. I have a little slide here on 10 talking about the issue of concussions. We have, helmets now because kids are, experiencing concussions while they are playing sports like football. However, even with the helmets, we're still seeing long-term impacts of head injuries, sometimes minor but repeated head injuries. And there's a debate within our society right now as to whether or not we should continue allowing these full contact sports, certainly among small children. When there are health problems, this is slide 11. Chronic conditions that can interfere with school. I've had a number of friends who spent time during their childhood or adolescence in hospital or at home dealing with an illness or a long-term injury or something like that that basically kept them out of the social environment. So during this time, kids may experience kind of like some of those psychosocial deficits from that lack of engagement with their peers or with lack of engagement at school. However, they are learning how to, cope with their illness, take care of their bodies, and so there are other psychological factors that are actually kind of beneficial that they're learning how to cope at this early age. So like with many things, we can experience simultaneous deficits or difficulties as well as increase or growth. We're going to move into childhood obesity here. This is, let's move to slide 13. Because we have a few different terms right here. We have our body mass index, which is the ratio of weight to height calculated by dividing a person's body weight in pounds by the square of his or her height in inches. Now, body mass index is a little bit controversial. It's used as a benchmarker, but that's really all it can be used for because it doesn't take into the account the nuances of the different shapes and structures of our bodies. So for example, in one of my previous classes, I had a weightlifter who scored, chronically obese, morbidly obese possibly even, and he is not. He just doesn't have any, very little fat on his body. It's muscle mass. And so it doesn't necessarily take into things like that. Also, as we'll be talking throughout the semester, each body has kind of a different set point at which it operates at its best function. Now, this set point does actually fall along a spectrum, a nice bell curve, like we see with many different things that are true about humans. And so we might have people in the extreme ends, but most of us fall somewhere in the middle. And so the body mass index can be a good benchmark, but it's not the end-all be-all. Yeah? And so we still use this BMI to identify, and again, your mileage may vary. Childhood overweight would be having a BMI above the 85th percentile according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's 1980 standards for children at a given age. And then childhood obesity would be having BMI over the 95th percentile. And again, this is at the 1980 standards, which is why we are seeing kids becoming more and more overweight, even as, you know, the average goes up as well. It's because we're using the 1980 average as just kind of like a checkpoint to show what change is happening across the society over time. Childhood obesity happens oftentimes because they eat too much. As we've talked about before, we have great access to calories and not necessarily enough access to exercise for those calories. Obesity now causes more deaths worldwide than malnutrition, which is really startling and in some ways maybe is a good problem to have. I don't know, but we do see that there are more than 42 million overweight children around the world, and that one of the difficulties that we see with this is that childhood overweight correlates with asthma, high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol. We're starting to see childhood instances of diseases that have been considered to be adult diseases dealing with kind of our affluent diet, so the Western access to many calories to meat and things like this, where it's starting to become apparent in children as well. The next couple of slides, I'll just, let you look through them. I enjoy the visuals because it kind of shows how we see different norms on what kids are allowed to consume in terms of media, and the programming that they may have or the exposure to commercials about sweets and breakfast cereals and fast food restaurants. And of course you can see in the United States, oh golly, we have a lot of commercials aimed at children. And in the next slide, on slide 16, you can see that this does often correlate pretty well with what kids are eating and then what their weight is. One of the issues that we see oftentimes developing in middle childhood is asthma, and we've talked about this before, particularly when there's a lot of exposure in the air. We see a lot more respiratory illnesses, and so areas that are poorly regulated, meaning that there's not imposed protections on businesses, and therefore they're allowed to, put pollutants or whatever else into the water or into the air. Can be a problem. We also see with smoking, secondhand smoke can lead to early childhood asthma. There's also, on the other hand, though, the hygiene hypothesis, which is when kids have some limited exposure to various pollutants, then it can actually form a protection against them. They'll have fewer issues with allergies, for example, and that, part of why we are having so many respiratory illnesses like asthma these days and other issues with allergies is just because we've basically reached a point in human civilization and development where we have such great hygiene that our exposures to these things are greatly limited. So the plus side of us no longer having the bubonic plague is that now we have asthma and allergies. So that could be a part of it. I would still rather have asthma than the bubonic plague. So keep bathing, folks. All right, so we've talked before, this is on slide 18, about the primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. And here we're applying it to asthma. And so again, primary prevention is something that is applied to the entire society to reduce a risk that happens to a lot of people. So we have clean air laws. They have been weakened over the years with deregulation, and that's really too bad because it's making our air quality worse again. But these laws, that's a primary prevention. Everybody breathes the air. Everybody has exposure to the air. It's going to be beneficial to all of us no matter what. And so these policies are there just as a primary for everybody. Secondary would be to decrease asthma attacks among high-risk children. So, for example, if children have asthma, they may partake in special like workshops or camps. I used to work in an asthma camp when I was on the Big Island, of course, right near an active volcano, and so yeah, there were issues with asthma. But basically, teaching kids how to deal with pollutants that they would come across all the time. So on a VOG day, that's volcanic smog, what to do in order to protect their health. If they're going to go out camping and there's a campfire, how to actually engage with the campfire but stay away from the smoke, and those sorts of things that are specifically geared toward helping those kids who are at the highest risk prevent any sort of damage from asthma attacks. And then tertiary prevention is when something has already happened, trying to prevent further harm from happening. And so this would be a kid is having an asthma attack, get them an inhaler, get them injections, get them to the emergency room if it's bad enough, so that basically they are able to recover from that asthma attack. Yeah. We're going to skip forward to slide 20 right now. With our brain development, we have increased speed of thought. Our reaction time is getting better throughout this childhood period. Our attention is getting better, and kids are better able to perform selective attention, where they pick what they want to focus on and then stay focused on that. It's an ongoing piece of development, but they're getting there. They're certainly better than 4 and 5-year-olds, and 11-year-olds will be better than 6-year-olds. So this is something that is increasing. We're also seeing increased automaticity or automation. So this is when they learn how to do things and they practice it over and over again to the point that they don't have to think about doing it anymore. So a 4, 5, 6-year-old learning how to write letters. They're going to write like whole pages of the letter A. Well, by the time they're 11 years old, they don't have to think about that anymore. They just write it out because they have this automaticity. Okay, so we're going to skip forward to slide 22, looking at brain development. So here's a couple of different terms we have for you. The first is aptitude. This is the potential to master a specific skill or to learn a certain body of knowledge. This doesn't mean that they actually have mastered that skill or that they do have access to that entire body of knowledge, that they have already learned it. It's just the ability to do so. An IQ test is designed to measure intellectual aptitude or the ability to learn in school. It is very kind of Western focused. There are IQ tests that are meant to be kind of culturally appropriate that you can give across the world, but there's differences in their effectiveness for actually identifying this specific type of intelligence correctly. As we've talked about before and we'll talk about again, there are multiple types of intelligence, and our typical IQ tests do not measure all of them. They measure that specific aptitude for achievement within an kind of academic or Western business model, depending on if you're a kid or if you're an adult. But this theoretical distribution that we see down at the bottom, it's the bell curve, right? And so this, interestingly enough, many, if not most, if not all, human skills and abilities kind of fall along this bell curve distribution. So you could think about like how fast people can run. You would have, Usain Bolt way up at the 160 sort of level, and then you'd have probably me somewhere in the average, I hope. I've been training, so I hope I'm at least average. Maybe not. And then folks who, don't want to run, can't run, don't have the skill or the ability, right? And everywhere in between. And the same thing we see with this aptitude, we see it with other forms of intelligence as well. And that 68.26% in the middle, that's the bulk of people. We're just somewhere in the middle. But then you start to see, folks who are particularly gifted in this, people who are particularly not gifted, and within the IQ distribution, we would still be looking at like intellectual disability, which used to be referred to as retardation, all the way through like intellectual aptitude or giftedness, that sort of thing. And it's a measurement. It's problematic in some ways, but it's also helpful in some ways, particularly in schools, identifying what kids are capable of doing, and then therefore how we can best support them within their education. Some of the achievement tests that we have, kids, are tested. They're over-tested. Dozens, hundreds, billions of tests that they have to take every single year. It takes away from class time. It's a real problem, and it's been noted that kids are over-tested, and there's too much emphasis on the outcomes of those tests in terms of how teachers are compensated for doing. And there's social issues with it. For example, schools are compared to each other on terms of just basically their rank testing, but it doesn't necessarily take into account if the school has very good special education services that they provide to a lot of people from all over the city. This other school does not have those services and therefore doesn't have a very high population of students who require special education services in order to learn. But the tests are kind of compared against each other. One of the issues that we also see is the Flynn effect. This is one of my favorites. It's the idea that IQ scores will raise over time in a society just for the very fact of there being IQ tests in a society. Once people get used to the idea that IQ tests exist and these are the sort of things that get asked on an IQ test, we develop those skills and get better at those skills. And so we constantly have to be re-evaluating and revising the tests to make sure that they're still accurately identifying what the actual IQ is. These different test intelligences that we have, this is on slide number 24. Sternberg, I really like the multiple intelligences that Sternberg brings. We have academic, creative, and practical, and the instruction can then be matched to analytic styles, creative styles, athletic abilities, etc., etc. Gardner also has multiple intelligences, 7 specifically in this one. In Gardner's, we have linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and later added on naturalistic and spiritual, existential. Each of these is associated with various regions in the brain, and this can be used in education, particularly for identifying children who have specific skills or gifts in one area that may be overlooked if we are focusing in on another area of their learning. And so it helps start to identify and support the development of the whole child. On slide 25, we are moving back into developmental psychopathology. I want to just once again issue this reminder. Psychopathology is, we're not talking about psychopaths. Literally, this term means an illness of the mind, right? And so it can be anything, and here we're looking at psychopathologies that are oftentimes going to have their earliest diagnosis in middle childhood. So we might be looking at like ADHD, we might be looking at anxiety disorders or depression or things like that, but it's going to be things that we often or commonly see affecting and influencing the outcomes of middle childhood children. Some of the things that we can see is that if it is not treated, or if the child doesn't find ways to cope with it on its own, they can continue to struggle with these issues on throughout life. The experience of disability changes year by year, and this is both contextual, the better society understands it, or their families understand it, or their school, but it's also our brains are still developing, and so we figure out new ways in order to interact, and as we are growing, new things are going to pop up that we haven't experienced before. It's very normal to have some sort of abnormality. All of us have something that we deal with. And it's really important to also notice that the diagnosis and treatment really reflect the social context. It's not to say that ADD or ADHD only exists in the United States because we have these high rates. I've met people, oh my God, classic ADHD symptoms, but they're in a society that just doesn't have that as a thing. And yeah, so the better or worse in adulthood is also kind of a fun one, particularly with ADHD. Kids who often struggle to sit still in school, focus long enough to do all of their homework and all of these things, once they are out on their own, living their lives, they tend to have very creative lives, very successful and active lives where they just, are constantly pushing new boundaries and doing all sorts of things. And they also tend to live longer because they move a lot, so they're healthy and active, and it can be quite beneficial, even as they may struggle with it as children. On slide 26, we have a couple of new terms that I want to point out. We have our multifinality and equifinality. Multifinality is that when there is one cause and it has multiple possible or final manifestations. You could think here with like someone who experiences an early childhood trauma. And then as they develop, that one event is going to cause, anxiety and attachment disorder or something like that. And so we might see like multiple final things that happen from this one event or this one issue. And then we have our equifinality, where one symptom, so for example, a person has distraction, may have many causes. The distraction may be in part because of ADHD, it may be in part because of the social context that they were raised in where they never had to deal with focusing, it may have to deal with all sorts of different things. So these two terms are some of the things that are considered, particularly within kids. They live very complex lives, and it's not always easy to tell what is causing what. Some of the disorders that we're going to talk about here that may be comorbid or often confused with each other. We have our ADHD, our attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are a number of different ways in which ADHD manifests. It can be like the attention issue, so ADD. It could have the hyperactivity component. It could have both, and so there's a lot of different ways, therefore, to respond to this issue, both in terms of medication, but also in terms of supports, depending on how exactly a child is presenting with this. Moving on to slide number 29, we have various learning disorders that are oftentimes beginning to be diagnosed in middle childhood as kids are, getting better or not sometimes with their schoolwork and with various things. We might see differences in like hand-eye coordination. We might see issues like dyslexia or dyscalculia. That's basically like dyslexia but with numbers. And so it can be very stressful for kids because things that come easily to other kids around them don't come easy to them, and so they feel like it's because they're not smart enough, when that's not how it is. Their brain is just processing the information differently. And so when they have the special education support, it's not to make things easier for them, it's actually just to provide them with the coping support so that they can learn the same way as other kids, because their brains just process the information differently. And then we have our autism spectrum disorder, which we've talked about before. This is on slide 32. Two of the main signs of the autism spectrum disorder are problems in social interaction and social use of language. We've talked about this before, particularly with very young children. We're talking like 2-3 years old. If they are taking in too much information on people's social lives, the other people's emotions become overwhelming. And so as a kind of a coping mechanism, they shield themselves from that, and it's a good way for them to process digest this overabundance of stimulation that they have. Also, because they're experiencing that same type of stimulation with everything in their world, things that they see with their eyes, they notice everything. All the stuff that neurotypical people will just filter out and not pay attention to because it's not important. Autistic people tend to notice all of these things. How many chairs are in the room? What color are the walls? Like all of these things that I don't care when I walk into a room. Similarly, the sensory, physical sensory, so everything that I touch, everything that I hear, it can just become like a giant jumble of stimulation. And so we see restricted, repetitive patterns in behavior. We like routines, heavy routines, so that's not a lot of new information coming in. When they are overwhelmed, we might even see like, moaning or rocking or something like that. And as I understand it, these are very comforting behaviors because it takes all of that sensory input and just quiets it down. So it might look alarming to neurotypical people who are outside of the situation, but it's actually evidence of a strong and probably good coping mechanism for that child to be able to kind of control what is happening within their brain and within their body at that moment. So on slide 34, this is the last slide for chapter 11, there's a YouTube video at the bottom, which I just kind of enjoy. It's a self-advocate with autism who, she's nonverbal, but she uses a computer to speak, and she talks about her experience growing up and her parents and her brother trying to understand what was going on within her brain when her brain is so very different from theirs. And it's a charming little video, and so I encourage you to take a minute to watch it. All right, we'll move on to chapter 12, and I will see you in a few.